Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer, where we last left off in Where the Red Fern Grows. We saw some examples of Old Dan and Little Ann's hunting techniques, particularly when it comes to hunting raccoons, or simply coons as they're called here. Now I want to know what happens next. It seems like there's going to be some trouble in the midst. I would like to check it out. And I'm sure you would too. Are you ready? Alright, let's begin. We are now halfway through the book in regards to chapters. Chapter 11. I had often wondered what old Dan would do if little Ann got into some kind of a predicament. One night, I got my answer. Aha! I knew there'd be trouble. For several days, a northern blizzard had been blowing. It was a bad one. The temperature dropped to 10 below. -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh! The storm started with a slow, cold drizzle, and then sleet. When the wind started blowing, everything froze, leaving the ground as slick as glass. Trapped indoors, I was nervous as a fish out of water. I told Mama I guessed it was just going to storm all winter. She laughed and said, "I don't think it will, but it does look like it will last for a while." She ruffled up my hair and kissed me between the eyes. This did rile me up. I didn't like to be kissed like that. It seemed that I could practically rub my skin off and still feel it, all wet and sticky and kind of burning. Sometime on the 5th night, the storm blew itself out and it snowed about 3 inches. The next morning I went out to my doghouse. Scraping the snow away from the two-way door, I stuck my head in. It was as warm as an oven. I got my face washed all over by little Ann. Old Dan's tail thumped out a tune on the wall. I told them to be ready because we were going hunting that night. I knew the old ringtails would be hungry and stirring, for they had been denned up during the storm. That evening, as I was leaving the house, Papa said, "Billy, be careful tonight. It's slick down under the snow, and it would be easy to twist an ankle or break a leg." I told him I would, and that I wasn't going far, just down back of our fields in the bottoms. "Well, anyway," he said, "be careful. There will be no moon tonight, and you're going to see some fog next to the river." Walking through our fields, I saw my father was right about it being slick and dark. Several times I slipped and sat down. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of my lantern, but I wasn't worried. My light was a good one, and Mama had insisted that I make 2 little leather pouches to cover the blades of my axe. Just before I reached the timber, old Dan shook the snow from the underbrush with his deep voice. I stopped and listened. He bawled again. The deep bass tones rolled around under the tall sycamores, tore away out of the thick timber, traveled out over the fields, and slammed up against the foothills. There they seemed to break up and die away in the mountains. Old Dan was working out the trail slowly, and I knew why. He would never line out until little Ann was running by his side. I thought she would never get there. When she did, her beautiful voice made the blood pound in my temples. I felt the excitement of the hunt as it ate its way into my body. Taking a deep breath, I reared back and whooped as loud as I could. The coon ran upriver for a way, and then, cutting out of the bottoms, he headed for the mountains. I stood and listened until their voices went out of hearing. Slipping and sliding, I started in the direction I had last heard them. About halfway to the foothills, I heard them coming back. Somewhere in the rugged mountains, the coon had turned and headed towards the river. It was about time for him to play out a few tricks, and I was wondering what he would do. I knew it would be hard for him to hide his trail with snow on the ground, and I realized later that the smart old coon knew this too. As the voices of my dogs grew louder, I could tell that they were coming straight towards me. Once I started to blow up my lantern, thinking maybe I could see them when they crossed our field, but I realized I didn't stand a chance for seeing the race in the skunk-black night. Down out of the mountains they brought him, singing a hound dog song on his heels. The coon must have scented me or seen my lantern. He cut to my right and ran between our house and me. I heard screaming and yelling from my sisters. My father started whooping. I knew my whole family was out on the porch listening to the beautiful voices of my little red hounds. I felt as tall as the tallest sycamore in the bank. I yelled as loud as I could. Again I heard the squealing of my sisters and the shouts of my father. The deep ahs of old Dan and the sharp ahs of little Ann bored a hole in the inky black night. The vibrations rolled and quivered in the icy silence. The coon was heading for the river. I could tell my dogs were crowding him, and wondered if he'd make it to the water. I was hoping he wouldn't, for I didn't want to wade the cold water unless I had to do it. I figured the smart old coon had a reason for turning and coming back to the river, and wondered what trick he had in mind. I remember something my grandfather had told me. He said, "Never underestimate the cunning of an old river coon. When the nights are dark and the ground's frozen and slick, they can pull some mean tricks on a hound. Sometimes the tricks can be fatal." I was halfway through the fog-covered bottoms when the voices of my dogs stopped. I stood still and waited and listened. A cold silence settled over the bottoms. I could hear the snap and crack of sap-frozen limbs. From far back in the flinty hills, the long, lonesome howl of a timber wolf floated down in the silent night. Across the river I heard a cow moo. I knew the sound was coming from the Lowery place. Not being able to hear the voices of my dogs gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I whooped and waited for one of them to bawl. As I stood waiting, I realized something was different in the bottoms. Something was missing. I wasn't worried about my dogs. I figured the coon had pulled some trick and sooner or later they would unravel the trail. But the feeling that something was not right had me worried. I whooped several times, but still could get no answer. Stumbling, hurling, slipping and sliding, I started on. Reaching the river, I saw it was frozen over. I realized that what my strange, uneasy feeling was. I had not been able to hear the sound of the water. As I stood listening, I heard a gurgling out of the middle of the stream. The river wasn't frozen all the way across. The still eddy waters next to the banks had frozen, but out in the middle, where the current was swift, the water was running, leaving a trough in the ice pack. The gurgling sound I had heard was the swift current as it sucked away through the channel. The last time I had heard my dogs, they were downstream from me. I walked on, listening. Uh-oh. I hadn't gone far when I heard old Dan. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't bawling on a trail or giving the tree bark. It was one long, continuous cry. In his deep voice, there seemed to be a pleading cry for help. Scared, worried, and with my heart beating like a churn dasher, I started toward the sound. I almost passed him, but with another cry he let me know where he was. He was out on the ice pack. I couldn't see him for the fog. I called to him, and he answered with a low whine. Again I called his name. This time he came to me. He wasn't the same dog. His tail was between his legs, and his head was bowed down. He stopped about 7 feet from me. Sitting down on the ice, he raised his head and howled the most mournful cry I'd ever heard. Turning around, he trotted back out on the ice and disappeared in the fog. I knew something had happened to little Ann. I called her name. She answered with a pleading cry. Although I couldn't see her, I guessed what had happened. The coon had led them to the river. Running out on the ice, he had leapt across the trough. My dogs, hot on the trail, had followed. Oh, God. Old Dan, a more powerful dog than Little Ann, had made his leap. Little Ann had not made it. Her small feet had probably slipped on the slick ice and she had fallen into the icy waters. Old Dan, seeing the fate of his little friend, had quit the chase and come back to help her. The smart old coon had pulled his trick, and a deadly one it was. Oh. I had to do something. She would never be able to get out by herself. It was only a matter of time until her body would be paralyzed by the freezing water. Laying my axe down, I let my lantern out in front of me and stepped out on the ice. It started cracking and popping. I jumped back up to the bank. Although it was sticky enough to hold the light weight of my dogs, it would never hold me. Little Ann started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done quickly, or my little dog was lost. I thought of running home for a rope or for my father, but I knew she couldn't last until I got back. I was desperate. It was impossible for me to swim in the freezing water. I wouldn't last for a minute. She cried again, begging for the one thing I couldn't give her. Help. I thought, if only I could see her, maybe I could figure out some way I could help. Looking at my lantern gave me an idea. I ran up the bank about 30 feet, turned and looked back. I could see the light, not well, but enough for what I had in mind. I grabbed my lantern and axe and ran for the bottoms. I was looking for a stand of wild cane. After what seemed like ages, I found it. With the longest one I could find, I hurried back. After it was trimmed and the limber and cut off, I hung the lantern by the handle of the end of it and started easing out on the ice. I saw old Dan first. He was sitting close to the edge of the trough, looking down. Then I saw her. I groaned at her plight. All I could see was her head and her small front paws. Her claws were spread out and digging into the ice. She knew if she ever lost that hold, she was gone. Old Dan raised his head and howled. Hound though he was, he knew it was the end of the trail for his little pal. I wanted to get a light as close to Little Ann as I could, but my pole was a good 8 feet short. Setting the lantern down, I eased the pole from under the handle. I thought, I'm no better off than I was before. In fact, I'm worse off. Now I can see when the end comes. Little Ann cried again. I saw her claws slip on the ice. Her body settled lower in the water. Old Dan howled and started fidgeting. He knew the end was close. I didn't exactly know when I started out towards my dog. I had taken only 2 steps when the ice broke. I twisted my body and fell towards the bank. Just as my hand closed on a root, I thought my feet touched bottom, but I wasn't sure. As I pulled myself out, I felt the numbing cold creep over my legs. It looked so hopeless. There didn't seem to be any way I could save her. At the edge of the water, I stood a large sycamore. I got behind it, anything to blot out that heartbreaking scene. Little Ann, thinking I had deserted her, started crying. I couldn't stand it. I opened my mouth to call old Dan. I wanted to tell him to